You're listening to an Airwave Media Podcast.
When you need to build up your team to handle the growing chaos at work, use Indeed Sponsored Jobs. It gives your job post the boost it needs to be seen and helps reach people with the right skills, certifications, and more. Spend less time searching and more time actually interviewing candidates who check all your boxes. Listeners of this show will get a $75 sponsored job credit at Indeed.com/podcast. That's Indeed.com/podcast. Terms and conditions apply. Need a hiring hero? This is a job for Indeed Sponsored Jobs.
Hey everyone, thanks for tuning in to episode number 533 of our Civil War podcast. My name is Rich.
And I'm Tracy. Hello, y'all. Welcome to the podcast.
As you guys will recall, with the last show, we looked at William Tecumseh Sherman's new plan, now that his armies were across the Chattahoochee, to conduct what he called, quote, a general right wheel to the north and east of Atlanta.
And we talked about how Confederate President Jefferson Davis decided to sack Joe Johnston and replace him with John B. Hood.
But we're actually going to begin this episode by backtracking a bit, because once the Federals had secured their river crossings, and once Joe Johnston felt that he had no alternative but to abandon the Shoup line and fall back across the Chattahoochee, well, by that act, he gave up a valuable industrial area to the Yankees.
From Roswell on the river above the railroad bridge down to the mouth of Sweetwater Creek, there stretched a 20-mile-long strip of land where streams that flowed into the Chattahoochee powered many mills, most of which produced cloth for uniforms for the Confederate armies.
Some of those establishments continued to operate right up until Federal cavalrymen walked in the door and ordered the workers out. Then they set fire to the buildings. And destruction of the Chattahoochee mills, when added to the loss of Rome and its industry and the ironworks along the Etowah River, constituted a severe blow to the rebels.
Once he'd retreated over the Chattahoochee, Joe Johnston had pulled the Army of Tennessee back to a line south of Peachtree Creek, only about 3 miles from downtown Atlanta.
Peachtree Creek flowed roughly from east to west, passing north of the city, before joining the Chattahoochee. Johnston seemed to have hoped that the stream would pose a serious obstacle to Sherman's advance by making it more difficult for the Federal armies to support and coordinate with one another. If so, perhaps the Confederates could find an opportunity to attack the Yankees.
Joe Wheeler's rebel cavalry took position in front of this new line, while William Jackson's horsemen had their usual spot on the Army's left. Hood's corps held the right of the line, and Hardee's troops manned the center. Then Polk's old corps, under its new commander, was on the left.
As you guys will recall, after the Bishop General's death on June 14th, Wing Loring, as senior division commander in Polk's corps, had taken command on a temporary basis. But Joe Johnston had informed Jefferson Davis that he wanted another division commander with the Army, Alexander Stewart, with Hood's corps, to take command of Polk's troops. Well, 12 days later, when he hadn't heard from Richmond one way or another, but fearing the silence indicated Davis had rejected his recommendation, Joe Johnston asked for Lieutenant General Dick Ewell to take Polk's place.
Ewell's name will of course be familiar to y'all from his time with Robert E. Lee's Army of Northern Virginia. Now, though, owing to Ewell's poor physical and mental health, Jefferson Davis rejected that suggestion and did finally approve Alexander Stewart's elevation to corps command.
Stewart assumed command of Polk's Old Corps on July 7th, replacing Wing Loring, who returned to the head of his division. To succeed Stuart as division commander in Hood's Corps, Johnston asked for his old friend, Major General Mansfield Lovell, who was then attached to the Army of Tennessee, but with no official command responsibilities.
And bonus points if you remember Lovell's name in connection with the Confederate defense of New Orleans back in the spring of 1862.
Yep. Well, in any case, here the Confederate president ignored Johnston's wishes and, without consulting him, selected Henry Davis, one of the brigade commanders, to command the division. So in the end, this was just another example of the friction that characterized the relationship between Joe Johnston and Jefferson Davis.
On July 6th, while the Federal armies were still north of the Chattahoochee, Sherman had telegraphed Henry Halleck in Washington that once he was over the river, quote, "I propose to make a circuit of Atlanta, destroying all its railroads."
Sherman wanted to avoid attacking the Confederates' Atlanta defenses head-on, and he realized that if the rail lines radiating from the city were cut, well, Atlanta would be useless to the Confederates, even if they managed to retain possession of it.
Once he was across the Chattahoochee, Sherman would have the freedom to operate against the city in either of two directions. He could shift downriver to strike below Atlanta against the railroads running to Macon and West Point.
And if successful, such a maneuver would carry the opposing armies into comparatively open terrain, which would favor the Federals and their superior numbers. However, the more likely result would be that Joe Johnston would transfer his main line of supply to the Georgia Railroad, which ran east from Atlanta to Augusta. That could also be Johnston's line of retreat if he was eventually compelled to give up Atlanta.
Sherman therefore decided to pursue his second option. He would extend his left north and east of Atlanta, seeking to destroy the Georgia Railroad so thoroughly that that route was closed off to Johnston.
Before shifting his forces to the east side of Atlanta, though, Sherman wished to cripple Johnston's rail connections with Alabama to the west. To do so, he planned a two-pronged raid. A mounted force coming down from Tennessee would undertake a long-range strike to cut the railroad in eastern Alabama between Tuskegee and Opelika, while the cavalry division of the Army of the Ohio struck at the tracks a short distance southwest of Atlanta. Major General Lovell Rousseau would command the former effort, while Major General George Stoneman commanded the latter.
Rousseau set out on July 10th, leading a column of some 2,500 cavalrymen south from the Tennessee River. Skirmishing occasionally with Alabama militia and small detachments of Confederate soldiers as he went, Rousseau reached Talladega on July 15th.
After thinking to themselves, this area would be an excellent spot for a superspeedway, well, the Federal raiders proceeded to destroy large quantities of stockpiled foodstuffs, including salt, sugar, flour, and bacon. Then, turning eastward, the Yankees destroyed the railroad as they went. By the time Rousseau was finished on July 17th and rode northeast to join Sherman in Georgia, his troopers had wrecked about 30 miles of track, burned bridges, and destroyed locomotives and rolling stock.
By striking west of Opelika, Rousseau had seriously disrupted rebel communications between Georgia and the Alabama-Mississippi region, and the Confederates would need at least 3 weeks to repair the damage and get the rail lines back into full operation.
Stoneman's raid, by contrast, turned into a fiasco. On July 13th, his cavalrymen captured a partially wrecked bridge over the Chattahoochee, 35 miles below Atlanta. The next day, Stoneman's troopers crossed the river in force. However, when a nearby detachment of Confederates opposed him, opening fire with artillery, Stoneman panicked, beat a hasty retreat back across the river, and burned the bridge.
When Sherman learned of the debacle, he ordered Stoneman to abandon the effort. Rousseau's success, though, meant that Sherman could focus his attention on the railroad east of Atlanta.
As we outlined in the last show, Sherman's new plan for his operations around Atlanta called for McPherson to pull the remainder of the Army of the Tennessee out of its position on the Chattahoochee below the city and swing upriver, passing behind George Thomas's lines and marching to Roswell.
From the bridgehead there, McPherson would move out to the east, arcing around Atlanta to reach the Georgia Railroad between Stone Mountain and Decatur.
As McPherson advanced from Roswell, Schofield and Thomas would swing forward on parallel routes, the former in the center of the Army group, the latter to the west. In this way, Thomas's Army of the Cumberland would act as the hinge, with McPherson on the outer edge of the right wheel and Schofield filling in the arc between Thomas and McPherson.
By July 17th, McPherson was at Roswell, and the Federals were ready to carry out Sherman's plan and begin the next, newest phase of the campaign.
That day, pushing out from the Chattahoochee, the Federals ran into stiff opposition from Wheeler's rebel cavalry. However, by evening, Schofield had reached the little settlement of Cross Keys, and McPherson and George Thomas were closing in on their objectives. The day's operations had advanced Sherman's forces from the Chattahoochee to Nancy's Creek, roughly halfway between the river and Peachtree Creek. Sherman was hopeful that his men would reach and cut the Georgia Railroad the next day, July 18th.
Back on the afternoon of July 9th, the day after Schofield's troops first splashed across the Chattahoochee near Soap Creek, another army forced its way across another river some 550 miles to the northeast.
A Confederate force under the command of Lieutenant General Jubal Early had erupted from the Shenandoah Valley, crossed the Potomac River into Maryland on July 5th, and 4 days later routed a hastily assembled body of Federal troops at the Monocacy River near Frederick, Maryland. 2 days after fighting their way across the Monocacy, Early's veteran rebels were on the outskirts of Washington.
Early's strike north into Maryland came after 2 months of hard campaigning by the opposing armies in Virginia. As y'all know, when Sherman had moved against the rebels at Dalton in northern Georgia, Ulysses S. Grant had taken the Army of the Potomac across the Rapidan and Rappahannock rivers to grapple with Robert E. Lee.
And so, while Sherman jabbed and maneuvered against Joe Johnston, Lee and Grant waged a titanic series of battles across northern Virginia. They clashed in the Wilderness, at Spotsylvania Courthouse, on the North Anna River, and at Cold Harbor. This great overland campaign ended in mid-June when the Federals failed in their first attempt to take Petersburg.
By that time, after 6 weeks of fighting, Grant had suffered some 65,000 casualties, which was more men than Lee had had in his army when the overland campaign began.
By continually blocking the Yankees' way forward, Lee had managed to keep Grant away from Richmond. If the two armies had been fighting on the face of a clock, they had started at 12, then fought their way to the southeast, past 1 o'clock, then down around 2 and 3 to 4.
More important, Lee had punished the Army of the Potomac more severely than any other Civil War army had ever been punished. Then, in mid-June, Grant found himself bogged down in front of the Confederate defenses that protected Richmond and Petersburg, the vitally important rail junction 23 miles south of the rebel capital.
The Army of the Potomac had been utterly exhausted by the Herculean effort to reach that point. Tens of thousands of veterans were left behind in shallow graves in the Wilderness or on one of the other battlefields, or sent off to hospitals in the rear. The worn-out men who remained, and the green troops who had been called forward to replace casualties, simply weren't able to make further major attacks, even had Grant wanted to make them.
Nor could the Yankees continue on around the face of the clock, south of Petersburg, to 6 or 7 o'clock without exposing their flank and supply lines to the Confederates and leaving Washington uncovered.
Grant also couldn't withdraw and start up again someplace else later without doing great harm to the Union cause. You see, the Butcher's Bill to reach this point had been a heavy blow to Northern morale, but to retreat now and admit the blood spilled in the recent battles had all been for naught would shatter it.
Grant had been checked. He had not taken Richmond, and he had not inflicted a significant and visible defeat on Lee's forces, while his own army had suffered staggering losses.
Grant hadn't even been able to prevent Robert E. Lee from detaching large numbers of rebel troops to operate elsewhere. Secure behind his fortifications, Lee in mid-June had sent Jubal Early off westward with about 1/3 of the Army of Northern Virginia. Old Jube had originally gone to dispose of a Yankee threat in the Shenandoah Valley, but Lee soon expanded his mission, and he quickly moved north down the valley and across the Potomac.
But Early couldn't stay in the Washington area for very long after his victory at Monocacy, because Ulysses S. Grant detached troops from the army at Petersburg and rushed them north to protect the capital.
And so Early fell back to the northern end of the Shenandoah Valley, where he remained both a threat to Washington and an embarrassment to the Lincoln administration. To add insult to injury, some of Early's cavalry burned Chambersburg, Pennsylvania on July 30th. Well, needless to say, a stalemate on the Richmond-Petersburg front, horrific casualty lists, the smoldering remains of a Pennsylvania town, and the threat of a rebel force lurking about the lower Shenandoah Valley weren't the sort of things that Lincoln or Grant had anticipated back in March when they laid plans for the summer's military operations. Confederate victories over Nathaniel Banks in Louisiana, over Franz Sigel at New Market in the Valley, and over Benjamin Butler at Bermuda Hundred, along with Grant's clear failure to achieve any of his objectives, and Early's stunning success in threatening Washington, all made it impossible for the administration to claim any major military triumphs as of midsummer, and politically, that spelled trouble with a capital T for Abraham Lincoln.
Tomorrow morning is knocking. Stock your fridge now. How about a creamy mocha frappuccino drink? Or a sweet vanilla? Smooth caramel, maybe? Or a white chocolate mocha? Whichever you choose, delicious coffee awaits. Find Starbucks Frappuccino drinks wherever you buy your groceries.
Choice Hotels get you more of what you value. Comfort Inn, it's calling your name. Save on the stay. Oh, and free waffles are yours to claim. Book direct at choicehotels.com.
Determined to make the rest of summer the best of summer? LL Bean has clothing and gear designed to do it all. Like sun-washed apparel that feels broken in from the start, rainwear for every surprise rainstorm, hand-sewn boat shoes, and of course, the iconic Boat and Tote, made right here in Maine to carry all your summer essentials since 1944. LL Bean, be an outsider. Visit llbean.com to learn more.
The battlefields of Louisiana, Georgia, and Virginia weren't the only sources of concern for the Lincoln administration during the spring and summer of 1864. On the political front, the presidential election scheduled for that fall was a source of great anxiety for Lincoln and his allies.
You see, as the calendar rolled over from 1863 to 64, it was by no means certain that the Republican Party would renominate Abraham Lincoln, or that he could win re-election to a second term, even if it did. No president had won a second term since Andrew Jackson in 1832, and no political party had even nominated an incumbent chief executive for another term since the Democrats did so with Martin Van Buren in 1840.
During the first 3 years of the war, many of Lincoln's policies had generated great opposition within the ranks of his own party. And as 1864 wore on, many Republicans who disagreed with the president's policies became restless and fearful that his unpopularity would drag them and the party down to defeat in the fall.
The radical Republican wing of the party had been disenchanted with Lincoln almost from the beginning of the war. The radicals regarded Lincoln as much too conservative and faulted him for not being zealous enough in using the war to strike at the institution of slavery, for being too lenient in his proposed post-war treatment of the rebellious southern states, and for vetoing several of their pet legislative measures.
Such conservatism as the president exhibited, they believed, both hampered a full prosecution of the war effort and threatened the Republicans' control of the federal government.
The radicals rallied first behind Secretary of the Treasury Salmon Chase, and then, after Chase's presidential ambitions were successfully torpedoed by Abraham Lincoln, they threw their support behind John C. Fremont, still maneuvering to deny Lincoln the party's nomination in 1864. Fremont, the great pathfinder, had been the Republicans' 1856 candidate, and in 1861, as a Union Army general in Missouri, he'd issued a proclamation granting freedom to slaves of Confederate sympathizers in the border state. But Lincoln had quickly overruled Fremont, lest his ill-conceived measure alienate Missouri's pro-Union slave owners, and out of concern that Fremont's act usurped Lincoln's own presidential powers.
However, Fremont's act had made him a hero to the radical Republicans. In late May 1864, a group of them met in Cincinnati, Ohio, and nominated Fremont for president on a platform calling for racial equality and the confiscation of land owned by Confederates.
But Lincoln, with an incumbent's firm grip on the party machinery, secured renomination on June 7th at the Republicans' regular convention in Baltimore. Even so, many in the party, at least 1/3 of the Republicans in Congress, according to historian James McPherson's estimate, they were displeased with Lincoln's renomination, and many of them went to work behind the scenes to replace him with a candidate more acceptable to the radicals. Some, for example, plotted to put forth Union general and pre-war Democratic politician Benjamin Butler, so as to win the votes of Democrats who supported the war.
They hoped to persuade Fremont to switch his support to Butler and withdraw from the race. Then Lincoln, they assumed, would have no choice but to do the same.
Then, Northern Democrats, of course, also hoped to deny Lincoln a second term. Many members of the party were appalled at the administration's suppression of the writ of habeas corpus, its use of the military to arrest and even try civilians, its suppression and censorship of newspapers, and its imprisonment of citizens, including some state legislators, without trial. Many peace Democrats had never favored a war against states that chose to leave the Union, and many others had become so sickened by the conflict and its attendant cost in blood and suffering, and so weary of the ongoing struggle, that they were willing to agree to independence for the Confederacy, if doing so would only put a stop to the killing.
Many peace Democrats, perhaps a majority, so opposed Lincoln's policies on emancipation and race that they wouldn't support a war for preservation of the Union after it also became a war against slavery.
Finally, there were many peace Democrats who believed sincerely that reunion could be achieved more effectively by a peace agreement which would allow the North and South to resume their antebellum sectional relationship rather than by continuing the war, which by definition drove north and south farther apart.
George B. McClellan was the leading candidate for the Democratic nomination. Little Mac had long advocated a very conservative Union war effort with the sole objective of restoring the pre-war status quo.
McClellan favored preservation of the Union, but opposed federal efforts to abolish slavery. Little Mac was keen to secure the 1864 Democratic nomination, which would give him the opportunity to win a victory at the polls to vindicate his long-standing opposition to the Lincoln administration's war policies. Well, then the Democratic Party also embraced other interests and factions. One of the more visible was a vocal peace at any price because the war is a bloody failure faction. Clement Vallandigham of Ohio was the leading figure for that block of the party.
And so, in 1864, the Democrats, according to James McPherson, were, quote, half opposed to the war and wholly opposed to emancipation.
And so, if war weariness grew in the North that summer, the Democrats might pose a real threat to Lincoln's reelection and to the effort to preserve the Union itself. The Democrats had originally scheduled their national convention to meet in Chicago on July 4th. However, thinking they'd take full advantage of whatever might develop militarily that summer, and also to allow as much time as possible for resentment to grow over the administration's unpopular domestic policies, the Democrats rescheduled their convention for the end of August, which was the latest date they would still have enough time to get their political machinery cranked up and running to support their candidate in the November election.
And as the summer wore along, as the casualty list lengthened and the Union armies failed to win any great obvious victory, war weariness did increase in the North, as did the number of people who favored peace.
So too did the number of Republicans who considered Abraham Lincoln a failed war president. Through June and July, many in the party came to increasingly believe that Lincoln simply couldn't be reelected in November. And so, as the Democrats watched from the wings, biding their time, and as discontent grew within the Republican Party itself, as Grant was stalemated at Petersburg and the administration was embarrassed by the scare that Jubal Early gave Washington, well, all of that meant the events taking place down in Georgia and the fate of Atlanta loomed ever larger in the public's eyes, and thus became even more important to both the Union and the Confederacy.
That means it's time for this episode's book recommendation, and our recommendation this time is Copperheads, The Rise and Fall of Lincoln's Opponents in the North by Jennifer L. Weber.
As always, you can find a complete list of our book recommendations if you head over to the podcast website, which is www.civilwarpodcast.org. By the way, we gave a couple of book recommendations for the 1864 election, including Copperheads, in a video we released over on Patreon this past week for the members of the Strawfoot Brigade. We also released Members episode number 167, which is about the completion of the dome on the U.S. Capitol building in Washington during the war. Anyway, there's info on the podcast website about joining the Strawfoot Brigade over on Patreon and supporting the show in that way.
Just like Clayton A., Anthony L., Travis P., and Dale G. did this past week.
A big thank you to them, and also to Andrew R., J.B., and Rick M. for their donations. And then last but not least, thanks to all of you for listening to this episode of the podcast. Tracy and I do hope that you join us again next time, but until then, take care.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.